Hello, everybody. Today's review is going to be of Monster, the Ed Gein story, which I gave an 8 out of 10 to. Now, this is the first one I've actually even been somewhat interested in watching because I am a fan of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies, which this story is based off of. Oh my god. Which the story is based off of. So I decided that I would watch this one because I kind of wanted to know exactly where they got their inspiration from, and I did learn quite a bit watching this show, exactly where the Texas Chainsaw Massacre got its inspiration from. Obviously, now they didn't go quite as crazy in the in those movies, I would say, as far as this went. This kind of went a little bit darker and deeper. Now, obviously, it's because you're following the actual killer, right? And I'm not a. I guess this was mostly based in like the late 1940s, early 1950s, from what I was gathering, because a lot of it took place and had ties to certain things that obviously happened much later on in life. Right now, we do know that Ed Gein doesn't die until he's in his 70s, and I'm not exactly sure what year it was. I looked it up, but I can't remember. I should have written it down. But anyway, that's not really super important, I guess, because the main story here is how everything kind of ties together, and it's crazy to think about all of the things that did tie together just from Ed Gein's story alone. Now, obviously, all of the serial killers that he kind of pushed to have the same kind of MO as he did, and so on and so forth. It was kind of interesting to see, and then just how his mind worked based on the way that his mother treated him and the girl that he fell in love with kind of pushed him to do certain things that he wasn't really necessarily comfortable with doing, but she was kind of pushing him to do those things, and eventually I think that kind of pushed him to a certain point, and he just kind of went off the rails. And of course the doctors, when he's in his psych ward, telling him he has schizophrenia. I'm not really sure how much of that is true or whether that might have been added into the show. uh, it's hard to tell after that point, right? But I know, like, a lot of the killings and stuff, obviously there's some sick things that he did with the digging up of the bodies, and of course obviously actually killing people and not really being able to differentiate between whether he was doing it or not, because he didn't seem like he was incredibly smart and kind of seemed like he could be easily manipulated, or at least that's the way this show kind of told his character or showed his character, I guess. So we'll go over the casting list just to kind of, I guess, get that out of the way. So we had Charlie Hunnam as Ed Gein, who I thought did a pretty phenomenal job as a serial killer. I didn't really think he would do a role like that, being as he's more like of the action kind of star. But I guess maybe, he didn't really want to be typecast as that. But seeing him from like Sons of Anarchy and doing things like King Arthur and so on and so forth, it was interesting to see him do a role like this, that's for sure. And then we had Suzanne Sun as Adeline Watkins, who was the love interest for uh, Eddie in this movie, as they referred to him a lot. Um, and she was a photographer, or an aspiring photographer, trying to kind of do the same thing, like with the crime scenes and so on and so forth. So, of course, she was pushing Ed to kind of do some of these things, and she eventually pushed him to the point of necrophilia, um, which is kind of crazy because all he wanted to do really was, get married to her. Kind of seemed like he was ready to settle down, even though he was doing all these crazy things like the digging up of the bodies because he could hear his mother's voice and so on and so forth. So that's where Hitchcock actually got the idea for Psycho, was the kind of mother-son relationship that Ed Gein had with his mother. He used that for his movie. I didn't know that the Psycho movie was based off of that, which is kind of crazy. And of course, sometimes they, cut between the scenes with Ed Gein and then obviously the killer from Psycho, right? But sometimes it was hard to tell what was fiction and what was real. But um, yeah, it was interesting to see like the ties to the movies, and obviously the ties to the other serial killers that come out years later that kind of try to keep the same MO as him. but I think it was a little more gruesome with some of them than, exactly what Ed Gein thought he was. And he had seen pictures from the Second World War of what the Nazis were doing, and all these comic books of this certain woman that did all these horrible things, and he was trying to follow in her footsteps, and eventually got to the point where, now I'm not really sure, because they said he had schizophrenia, I'm not really sure how much of it was real. Now, we did see her get captured and put in jail, and then apparently they talk, and she tries to say that, she wasn't necessarily the person they painted her out to be. So again, it's kind of hard to tell, you know, whether whether we're actually seeing that for real or not, or whether that's just all in his head. So we had Vicky Krieps as Ilsa Koch, I believe is how you pronounce her name. Now, obviously, they kind of poked fun at her last name in the movie. In the show. I'm not even gonna say that because it was just kind of rude, regardless of what she may or may not have done. We had Laura Metcalf as Augusta. Yeah, Augusta Gein, so that was the mother. Hudson Oz as Henry Gein. Now, he comes in and tries to say that, he's living a pretty good life. He's found a woman, gonna settle down. Now, his mother has always said, no Gein man should touch a woman. It's against, like, she's super religious, so she's trying to say that it's, like, against religion and so on and so forth. And she's trying to keep her son in the house, or keep her son with her, I guess, technically. Now, she does end up having a stroke, obviously, after losing Henry, which was kind of surprising because it seemed like she basically disowned him at a certain point, but I guess it is what it is, right? It's still your son, so you're still going to be sad. She ends up having a stroke because of it, and then, of course, after a while, she ends up passing away because she's supposed to be resting, but the mother was super stubborn in this show and just didn't want to take no for an answer. And she didn't think that Eddie could get anything done, so she was, of course, adamant about doing it herself. And then ended up getting her killed because she was being too stressful on her body after having a stroke. So, of course, then that's when he starts to hear all the voices from his mother, and he starts digging up these dead bodies to, I guess, in his head, he was bringing his mother back. Even though it wasn't his mother's body that he had dug up, he was still calling her mother, and he said he was trying to explain to Adeline at one point that his mother was living inside of that body, and she bought it. Like, she was kind of a little bit nuts too, I guess, because she was kind of into, like, the whole taking the pictures of the dead bodies and stuff thing, like, really fascinated by crimes and so on and so forth and that kind of stuff. So she was a little off her, I guess you could say a little off her rocker herself, but she seemed to be really close with Ed Gein, and she seemed to be the only one that kind of understood maybe what he was doing. Now, of course, I don't think she knew that he had maybe actually killed people, but it was hard to say whether she had or not, and she just didn't care that he was killing people, and she just kind of went along with it. But, I mean, she never ratted him out, so, I mean, she was kind of like the perfect woman for him in that case. And then we had Addison Rae playing Evelyn Hurtley, who was the babysitter who took over Ed Gein's so-called babysitting job. Of course, I don't think he was really going to be a babysitter. It was just kind of like Adeline's idea that he should be around some children, because he wasn't really thinking about having kids. But then she thought maybe if he was around some kids that he would get the baby fever. But it ended up being a super creepy scene, because he ends up showing the kids a bunch of the stuff that he has in his house, and he doesn't even really think that it's real, right? He thinks he's just kind of changing himself into a woman, which he also thought that that's what he wanted, which was kind of crazy, obviously, to, I guess he was so fascinated with, I can't remember the term that the one woman used in the show, but it wasn't like he wanted to change his sex. It was like he was just so fascinated with the female body or whatever that he wanted to be inside of it, in a sense, which is just such a weird concept. So then we had Leslie Manville as Bernice Warden, who was also, she was an older lady, owned the hardware store. He ends up killing her after he thinks his mother has told her a whole bunch of stuff about her and how she had some sort of venereal disease and now it was passed on to him. And he ends up killing her, of course, and then doing some pretty nasty things with her. And then we had Tom Hollander as Alfred Hitchcock, who obviously we know made the Psycho film and then became pretty famous off of that. And then, of course, he kind of wanted to go a different way, but of course, everybody was so obsessed with the Psycho film that they ended up being a sequel. Not to my knowledge that it even had the same guy in it, but apparently it did. Uh, and we had Joey Polari, who played Anthony Perkins, who was the actor um, who actually played Norman Bates in Psycho. So, kind of cool to see all the ties, right? And I guess, in a sense, Anthony Perkins kind of struggled the same way that with certain things like Ed Gein did, but eventually he decided that he didn't want to live that life anymore. So it was kind of interesting, and then eventually, he wasn't really. Uh, he kind of was like typecast as like that certain person in that movie, right? And it was hard for him to get another role after he decided to take that role. So kind of crazy, and you get to see all the stuff that was. He got to see all the stuff that was in Ed Gein's house because I guess it was the way they left it when they found it, the police. So kind of wild that he got to see all that stuff. Now, I'm not really sure whether that was true or not, or whether that might have been added in. Again, I feel like there was some stuff that might have been added in the show to kind of add to the um, lore of the killer, right? And then we had, uh, obviously, some of the killers that were inspired by uh, Ed Gein, and I think the three top ones were, at least in my opinion, that they showed on the show was Tobias, played by Richard Speck, who was played by Tobias Jelinek. And then we had John T. O'Brien, who played Ted Bundy, who kind of was under the same MO, obviously, as Ed Gein, right? And then we had Happy Anderson, who played Jerry Brudos, who they were interviewed first, and then they decided that they were going to go back and interview Ed Gein. And that was probably one of the more chilling episodes, like not even watching what he did, but the fact that he explained the weapon that Ted Bundy might go and eventually get to dismember his kills. And he described it down to a T, like even the grade of the saw that he would have to get. And I was like, I had chills up my spine during that point because I was like, okay, this is him literally admitting that he had killed people. Even though he, kind of admitted it to the psychiatrist that told him he had schizophrenia. He said, is that why I dug up all those bodies and killed those people? And of course, by that point, it's too late to even tell, right, whether he is telling the truth or not, because he's been in this psychiatric hospital for so long that the psychiatrist isn't even gonna probably bat an eye at that, because you don't know for sure, because at this point he's seeing so many things that he can't tell whether what's real and what's fiction, right? So again, it's been like that kind of for him his entire life, because even the one scene on the tractor where he has a hallucination, I'm not going to go into great detail about it because I don't want to ruin everything, but he has a hallucination when he's on the tractor, and of course, he kind of goes to show you just how far he was, lost after his mother had passed away. And then we had Charlie Hall, who played Deputy Frank Warden, and Tyler Jacob Moore, who played Sheriff Art Shelley. And the scene where they were going through the house, I was like, okay, are they going to find anything in here that's going to really incriminate Ed Gein in that episode? Because I was kind of sure that they weren't going to catch him until the very last episode, but I guess they had a couple episodes kind of explaining further into the future, right? So it was interesting to see all the ties. And of course, Ed Gein was the one that ended up helping the cops catch Ted Bundy. So kind of a wild turnaround there. I wasn't expecting that at all, but uh, I guess he was the anonymous source that ended up tipping them off, thanks to Richard Speck, who was a admirer, obviously, of Ed's, and sent him a whole bunch of letters. And of course, Ted Bundy had sent Richard Speck a letter, so he sent that letter to Ed Gein, and then Ed was telling the one cop about everything that he had read. So eventually, Ted Bundy was caught thanks to another famous serial killer. It kind of seems crazy. And then, of course, at the very end, when he passes away, it shows him reuniting with his mother, and I guess that was really the only person he ever wanted to make proud, and unfortunately, he just didn't ever, live up to her, and kind of defied her after she died, and it was just kind of spiraled from there, the path he went down. So it's kind of sad to see, because obviously a lot of the things he thought that he wanted were because of the abuse he took from his mother. And again, I can't really say I have sympathy for him because of what he had done, but he probably wouldn't have done the things he did if his mother had treated him better when he was a child, obviously, because the things that he was doing to rebel when he was a kid, his mother just told him, would scream and yell and all that sort of thing, and tell him it was bad, like against God and all this sort of stuff, instead of just, sitting down with him and saying, you know, you shouldn't be doing these types of behaviors, because as you grow older, it's going to spiral. And eventually it did, because of the way she handled the whole situation. And even into his older age, he was still acting out, and she was still treating him like he was a child, even though he was a full-grown adult. And that would be why his brother left, because he was probably being treated the same way, and thought, I need to get out of here before I'm completely corrupted. Which is unfortunately what happened to Ed, and he was corrupted by his mother, and then he was corrupted by the girl that he fell in love with. So it was kind of a wild thing to see, that everybody that was really close with him, or that he truly loved, just pushed him even further into what he was already doing. And some of it seemed like he had an issue with. So there was some sort of thing in his mind that was telling him certain things he was doing was wrong, but because he was convinced by other people that it would be okay, he went ahead and did it. So kind of wild. Now, there was one scene in there in the institute that he was in, where she says, I don't really think you're as stupid as people make you out to be. I think you're a lot smarter than you let on. And he smiled. Now, again, I'm not really sure whether he was just smiling because he's laughing at her for thinking that he's taking that as a compliment, or whether because of what she's saying to him, she thinks that, he's actually, not as, he actually is pretty smart, and he will find a way to, get out, maybe. And he does have that hallucination where he kills her in the psych ward, but of course that didn't obviously happen. And eventually, once he gets on the pills to help him with the schizophrenia, he ends up hugging her. So it was kind of a weird turnaround. And then, of course, as he ages throughout the years, then finds out that he has cancer and passes away. Now, I'm not really sure whether they were trying to help you or trying to give you some sort of sympathy for him, but I can't really have sympathy for a serial killer, like the things that he did, the digging up of bodies and actually killing people. It's hard to say how many people he actually killed, and how many people he dug up, because even he couldn't recollect exactly what he had done. And even the lie detector test, it was kind of hard for him to really tell the truth, because he couldn't tell fact from fiction. So there you go. That's the Ed Gein story, and how it tied into all these other killers and all these other films. Now, again, I guess in the slasher genre, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre didn't really become a franchise until much later on. So the original slasher franchise is Michael Myers. Now, I would be kind of interested to see exactly if there was a tie to some sort of serial killer there too, as to those movies, but I did know that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was loosely based on Ed Gein, so I did want to actually watch this one because I was interested to see exactly how deep and dark the story was. And oh boy, let me tell you, I can see why they had to dim it down a little bit for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie and kind of make it into like a family affair where everybody was kind of somewhat, I guess, maybe like a different personality, maybe. And I guess maybe that kind of like tied into like a schizophrenia as to why everybody was slightly different um, in the movie. Now that makes a little bit more sense. Anyhow, I'm kind of just rambling on now. 8 out of 10 is what I gave this season. Now, I might go back and watch the Dahmer one now, just because I missed out on it. I don't really know that much about the Menendez brothers, but I, I don't really know. It doesn't really look like as good of a season, so I'll probably go back and watch the Dahmer one and then maybe rate the actual show on an overall basis just on that. And the next season looks like it could be interesting too because we're going even further back in time. So I'm not really sure exactly what like how all these stories tie together, but it seems that the next season might even have ties to some of the killers we saw in this season. So I'm interested. I'm kind of invested now, I guess. So yeah. Anyway, I will see you guys in the next review. Bye bye for now.